grew up in a town called Weatherby that's about 80 miles away. So I know what it's like living around here. And just to prove it, that's the accent. So we're clear. I'm going to talk about people. I don't have any mice or any other animals in the talk. I'm going to talk about experimental evidence, and you'll probably hear me talk about observational data. A lot of times we would like to be able to say, we took some people, we put them in this room, we removed every other stimulus, but I can't do that. So we observe people, we follow them for long periods of time. And I'm going to attempt to integrate a few things, so beyond protein. So while I'll give you the whole truth and nothing but the truth about protein, I'm going to talk about a few other things as well. So some questions. Why do we age? What happens? My son, who's about 20 now, watched me make this talk, and he said, well, we age because we get older, Dad, you know, duh. And I said, you're right, but there are some mechanisms. What can we do to slow aging, or maybe slow or mitigate the processes that are associated with aging, like disease? I'm going to talk about the central importance of what I've studied for over 30 years now, which is skeletal muscle. If you talk about muscle, you obligatorily have to talk about protein. And I'll talk about what I think is the perfect, in quotation marks, aging active formula. I'll talk a little bit about protein, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I'll explain that when it comes along. And then I'll try and put it all together in one slide so that you can walk away with some actionable things. And when you write your bestseller and you're sitting on, I don't even know if there's the British equivalent of Oprah, but on Oprah's couch, you can say, Phillips inspired me to do this. So why do all things age? And we now have very good mechanistic data to show you what happens at a cellular level that breaks down, that is responsible for cellular aging. When you put all of these things together in the different organs in which they occur, you begin to get things like Alzheimer's, dementia, you begin to get type 2 diabetes, you begin to get all types of organ system failure, and it's not just chronological age. In our experience, and we've run studies in humans now for over 25 years, we occasionally pluck interesting individuals, I'll call them, that are in their 80s that are taking no medications at all and are free from disease. And I'll maybe tell you a little bit about what they do. But aging is happening. This is aging, and this is the last time that the pyramid in the UK looked sort of pyramid shaped, and that was in 1950. I thought I put up 1950 because there'd be a few people who could remember 1950 here. There's about 50 million people. You can see that the salmon pink, and that's the females, always outnumber the blue because that's the way it goes. There's what the pyramid, it's not pyramidal, you'll note anymore, looked like in 1990. There's what it looked like at the turn of the century. And this is what it looks like today at 69,000. And I highlighted the top of the pyramid to show you that you have over 18,500 individuals that are topping 100 years old. You can walk into a shop now and buy cards for congratulations, you're 100. And that says something about what we've done with aging. This is the forecast for what will happen in 2040, where when you look around the UK, you'll find that almost 1 in 4 people is over the age of 65. So you could look to your left, to your right, behind you, and you'll see somebody who's 65. It's not dissimilar in Canada. In fact, it's not dissimilar in just about every other country in the world with respect to at least developed or westernized nations. And there's an aging myth, and that is there's something immutable about age, that you can't really do too much about it. You look at your parents, you look at your grandparents, and they are your fate. But I'm here to tell you that you can change things. Maybe not a lot, but I'll just surprise you, I think, with some data. The Scandinavians have done the best job on looking at twin pairs. And what they've noticed is that between twin pairs, there's tremendous heterogeneity in how they age. And that probably wouldn't surprise people. Twins living in this part of the country, this part of the country, pursuing different lifestyles. And it's in the order of 15 years between twin pairs. But the variability, even within a twin pair, so the closest human equivalent we would have to a clone, if you like, is as much as 8 years. One twin lives a different way than another twin. So what is it that we have to worry about as we age? And the statistics in the UK are actually quite interesting, and I'll just contrast to the statistics in Canada, for example. The leading cause of death, and now I know there are probably people in here who have looked at a death certificate, and people, they write, death due to, and they'll write dementia, Alzheimer's, but something else is going on, chronic heart failure, type 2 diabetes, and so they're not really sure what caused death, but that's what they list. And that's number one. In Canada, it's cancer. Heart disease is number 2. Globally, it's heart disease. But the way the death certificates are written up here in the UK, this is the number one concern. And it's probably important for you all to realize that we don't have a drug to treat dementia. We have a drug to treat Alzheimer's. We've got a few not so good ones that can kind of slow the trajectory. So the whole goal would be to not have it happen in the first place. But surely it's not just about mortality, the rate of which I point out to my undergraduate students is holding constant at 1.0. We can't avoid it, right? Death and taxes. It's about quality of life. And this is where the concept, not just of longevity, which you hear about in the news quite a bit, but health span comes in. And we just heard Professor Benjamin Miller talking about health span, but I'll sort of give you, my take on it. So the question is, the poll is, which of the leading chronic diseases are associated with a reduction in quality of life? If you ask people, what is your health-related quality of life? And the answer is that all of them are. The number one disabling condition as people get older is generally reported as being osteoarthritis. Incontinence is up there as number 2, at least in the data that we have in Canada, because of what it does to your life. It shrinks your life space. It forces you to consider whether you would do one thing or another, how you interact with people, whether you can interact with people, activities that you can do. So this figure sort of summarizes it up, and I'll just give you a quick tutorial here. It's a great figure. This is the Grim Reaper here, and what we've done in the last century is added 30 plus years to our life expectancy. But what we haven't changed is the period of our life in which we are experiencing some type of morbidity, some type of chronic disease, something that is affecting our health-related quality of life. What we would like to do is compress morbidity. We'd like to live for as healthy for as long as we can, and then at some point you realize age is going to get you, and that's going to happen. And so this increase in health span is really the goal in terms of longevity research so far as I'm concerned. I don't know about you, but I have little interest in living to be 120 and feel like I'm 120. So what can we do to slow aging? I think a non-negotiable part is that we have to be physically active and mobile. And I'm sort of going to use that as the fulcrum around which a lot of the arguments that I'm going to make forward. So being active and being mobile, I have to talk about my favorite tissue, and that's muscle. And that's not to poo-poo a lot of my colleagues in the audience who deal with things like tendons and bones and other things that are equally as important. Brains, livers, that sort of thing. Also important, but ideal in muscle. So when we talk about muscle, we have to talk about sarcopenia. And sarcopenia is the age-related loss of muscle. It seems to be that it's inevitable that it's going to occur. The question is the rate at which it occurs and when you cross a particular threshold, which I'll show you, and what we can do to push back against that. And there's really two big degrees of freedom. One is physical activity, which I'll talk about, and the other then is dietary protein. Probably lots of other things that we could talk about as well, but those are the two that I'm going to focus on today. So, as the figure on the left, which is actually not really sarcopenia, it's just taking the image and shrinking it to a little trick there. But that's essentially what sarcopenia is. And I have to give the guy who coined the term credit here. This is Rosenberg. And a few lines in here. There's probably no decline more dramatic in life than muscle mass. It affects, and he's got here, ambulation, mobility, energy intake, overall nutrient intake status, and independence. Because once muscle and the qualities that are associated with it, strength and probably power as well, go down to a certain point, you begin to lose the ability to do activities of daily living. And when that happens, you lose, at some point, your independence. And he says, I propose a name derived from the Greek called sarcopenia. Sarc is for flesh, and penia is for loss. These are the types of graphs that are sort of stereotypical that we look at to say, when does this decline in muscle mass happen? It's at 64, I used to say 1,000, but that's not a lot anymore. I'll say $1 million question. When does sarcopenia start? The depressing part, it probably starts for a lot of people in your 30s and in your 40s. So if you know the story about osteopenia and osteoporosis, it's build up your bone so that when you hit, for women, the menopausal transition, or for males, just aging, the higher you are in your decline is probably a similar story to muscle. So you like to build it up and make yourself as strong as you can to resist that decline and change. Unlike bone, you can actually change the trajectory a little bit. All right, and I'll show you what sort of consequence that has. These are the types of figures that we like to draw and show you. Now, this is grip strength, and I use grip strength because everybody can use a hand grip dynamometer to show you how strength declines. And you'll notice that it appears to be a little bit earlier, and I think it's a better reflection of the muscle and the integration, not just of the muscle itself, but the brain talking to a nerve, the nerve talking to a muscle, and the muscle having an action. It's somewhere in your 30s and 40s. And then there's a little bit of an inflection in the curve you can see probably around your 50s. Females, women, obviously not quite as strong as men, but the curves follow similar types of patterns, maybe not as precipitous a bend in the curve. So why is muscle so important? And the concept is that muscle declines, and then at a certain point, we reach a threshold. And it's not an on-off light switch, it's probably like one of those dimmer switches. Okay, so that some people hit that threshold and they notice that there's something in their life that they can't do. And it affects what they want to do. At some point, that threshold is so critical that it prevents you from doing a very basic activity. And the most basic one would be to rise up from a chair. And once you can't do that unassisted, then your chances of having some disability and needing care are much greater. So this is what we would like to do. Now, a point that I make to people is that when this curve begins to go down, even if you have about a 1 to 1.5 degree change in the angle of how that curve declines, then the curves diverge, and the difference, or the time period where you hit this threshold, could be as long as a decade. So a decade of more independent living seems like a fairly attractive proposition. This is a graph that a graduate student drew for me, and you can tell the joke already because age-related loss, they say, starts at age 50. I think it's age 59. That's just a personal reflection. This is a cross-section of your muscle from an MRI scanner or a CT showing you muscle mass, and this is what happens when you age. And just to make the point, muscle mass goes down by about 1% per year, muscle strength by about 3% per year. We still really don't know why this happens. It could be because of changes in hormones, because of changes in blood flow, changes intrinsic to the muscle itself, but there's 2 degrees of freedom over which we have control. First is our ability to be physically active or to do exercise, and second, nutrition. The problem is with aging is that we have a phenomenon that's begun to be coined anabolic resistance that happens in muscle. And it's that muscle becomes less responsive to normally anabolic stimuli like exercise and like protein ingestion. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. So talking then about protein first. And I'm just going to make this point it's getting fairly old now, but a review that a postdoc of mine, Dan Traylor, wrote several years ago, where we looked and challenged the concept of what's known as the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA, or in the UK it's the recommended nutrient intake, which sits around 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Okay, so I know I can do grams, or I can do pounds to kilos, because I talk to a lot of American audiences. So 0.8 is about 0.35, but I'm defied by stones. Somebody said, "What is that in stones?" I said, "I have no idea." This is 14 pounds in stone? I don't know who came up with that. It's amazing. Because base 14 math is so easy, right? Anyway, so just bear with me. 0.8 grams per kilo, or 0.35 grams per pound. Myself and a number of other people think that that's too low, particularly for older people. And we attempted to summarize in looking at a series of studies that use 2 methodologies, one of which is nitrogen balance. That's actually the method that's used right now. And another method is called the indicator amino acid oxidation method. Doesn't matter which method, but taking at face value the numbers that these people come up with, we come up with an estimate, if all of these are correct, and adjusting for the number of subjects, of about 1.16. Okay? I like to round up to make the math a little easier, say 1.2. So 50% higher than what's currently recommended. But what you will read, and the British press are very good at this, the tabloids in particular, saying everybody gets enough. And my point would be, if you use the wrong number that's too low, then it seems like everybody is getting enough. But older people, for a number of reasons that I'll talk about, or probably less of them anyway, are hitting this target. And that's reflected in a number of consensus definitions by a number of agencies that have come together to say, what do older people really need? And you can see that we've got, and I've been involved in some of these, minimum intakes of between 1 and 1.2, so at least 25 to 50% higher. Higher if you have acute or chronic disease, and we can talk about what those are, or much higher if you have severe illness, okay, critical illness. Okay, hopefully that's not too many people, but you can see the point here. This is not sort of, Phillips picking a number out of the air. These are consensus definitions from a number of different agencies. And there's some important points to make with respect to aging. First of all, aging in and of itself is associated with a reduction in food intake. Appetite goes down, so that's a predisposing factor to protein, energy. I won't call it malnutrition, although that is a problem in some cases, but undernutrition. At the same time, we know that when you put older people on a diet that contains protein at the RDA, even for a short period of time, 12, 16 weeks, they lose muscle. And there are a number of other studies that I could talk about to sort of make that point that that amount of protein isn't sufficient to maintain muscle. So older adults, at least in my and a number of other people's opinions, need more protein than the RDA. They need at least 1.2, and other intakes could be better. And the really important part is that older adults are not getting these intakes. Despite what you will hear in the press, and I mean on a regular basis, everybody's getting enough. That's by using the 0.8 as the yardstick. So we're talking about 1.2, we could be talking even higher. I'm going to give you a quick crash course in what we call muscle protein turnover. And I'm sorry, I promise not too many biochemical pathways or anything else like this. And I've got an analogy that I think works. Proteins in muscle turnover. It's as if your muscle is a brick wall, and there's one group that's putting bricks into the wall, and there's another group that's taking bricks out of the wall. So imagine you had an old house, and instead of letting the mortar between the bricks and everything sort of crumble, there's somebody chipping those out and somebody putting those back in. It's as if you're sort of turning over the bricks in the wall. All right? This is sort of how it works, and these are the diagrams that we use. This is what happens in younger people. This is breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or tea. Is it tea? Who says tea? That's an Nolan thing, isn't it? Yeah. Right. So the yellow line represents muscle protein synthesis, or new bricks going into the wall, and the red line represents old bricks being taken out of the wall. And you can see when we eat protein at breakfast, we get a stimulation of protein synthesis. We get this green area, we get this red area here, and it means we're making a new piece of the wall at least. But then we don't eat for a period of time, and synthesis goes down, and now red is greater than yellow, and we're losing a piece of that wall. But then we have our lunch, and we make more wall, then we'd have our dinner, and so on and so forth. So this turnover is going on all the time. What happens in older people is that instead of having this response, you get a diminished anabolic response, and it looks like this. That's what we call anabolic resistance. So every time an older person eats a little bit of protein, they don't quite get the same stimulation of protein synthesis. And it doesn't take too much to imagine that now we're not making as much new wall, but we're still breaking down the old wall, and all of a sudden the wall is starting to sort of crumble and it's not being built quite as efficiently. 2 degrees of freedom. So we're going to change one of them, and that's to increase the amount of protein that we would intake to try and push the system. But it's probably not the best strategy. It's the tougher of the two. The reason is that most people tend to eat their protein not the way that I've described it, but the way that Sarah Okawa, PhD student of mine, is drawn in this figure, is that they have a small amount at breakfast, usually about 12 grams. They follow the guidelines, which are heart healthy breakfast, low protein, not the full English, okay? But higher in carbohydrates and dietary fiber. And so you get this small stimulation at breakfast. And then you get bigger stimulation at your lunchtime meal, but you get the big guest stimulation at your dinner time meal. That's fine if you're a younger person, excuse me. That's fine if you're a younger person, because this is the threshold on a per meal basis at which you hit the amount of protein that you need. But if you're an older person, you might only hit it once per day. So you're anabolically resistant. You're only getting enough protein maybe at one meal per day, because you eat the largest amount of protein, as most people do, at their dinner time meal, at least in the northern hemisphere. Flip it around a little bit in the Mediterranean region where lunch is a much bigger deal. But you get the point. Not enough protein, probably only doing it at one meal. The consequences begin to add up. There's an active amino acid in this whole process. And not to dwell too much, but it's like the brick that when it shows up, it sort of says to the whole system, okay, it's time to start making the wall. And that amino acid is something called leucine. It has a particular chemical structure, and it signals through too much biochemistry, I get you, but a mechanism which runs all the way from yeast up to human beings. It's what we call, it's an evolutionarily conserved mechanism, and we know now, I won't bore you with this, how it works. But here's a really important finding. And this is a young woman named Sylvia Zwiga working with a colleague of mine, Glenda Courtney-Martin at the University of Toronto. And in this, they found that the leucine requirements, looking at the individual amino acid leucine for older men, and you can see over women it's even higher, were 2 times greater than what is currently recommended. So they concluded that the estimated leucine requirements is more than double what is in current recommendations, and that maybe leucine is so important in muscle protein synthesis that the current recommendations for leucine for older adults should be revised. The same message, because leucine, we could all go out and supplement with leucine, although I can tell you from experience it tastes like hell. But when it's in protein, it's actually pretty tasty. So this is another way of saying that older people not only require more leucine, but require more protein. Because I'm not a huge fan of supplementing your way out of problems. I think it's much more pragmatic to recommend a choice of food, and enjoyable too, I think. This is just to remind you that not all proteins are created equal. And I'll make a really quick point here. This is whey protein, which is a milk protein. This is milk protein. These are soy proteins, pea protein, rice protein, and this is collagen. I add collagen more recently because you can see this protein being touted by a number of people as a solution as you get older. And just to make it really, really clear, you need 4 times as much collagen to get the amount of leucine that is present in milk proteins, and about twice as much that is present in these plant protein sources to get the leucine that you need here. In fact, I'll make it even clearer for you. Collagen as a protein, if you were stuck on a desert island and all you have is collagen, you'd be dead. It has a protein quality score of 0. If you've got milk protein or soy or pea or rice, you're all good, but you'd die if you had collagen. So don't believe the hype. So, is there a specific time of day when we need more protein? I would argue it's probably that first meal where older people are consuming the smallest amount of protein. It's the first chance you get to stimulate and turn on muscle protein synthesis and to avoid this anabolic resistant phenotype that we see. The great news is that loading, or as the graphic implies here, resistance exercise or weightlifting or a little bit of doing something is really, really good for you. In fact, we can completely rejuvenate this response in older people by having them lift some weights. It doesn't require going to the gym. It doesn't require chalk dust and a weight belt and great equipment and a heavy bar. You can do it using elastic bands. You could do it going up and down stairs. You could do it lots of different ways. But you can rejuvenate this response. Similarly, we can make young people look older by making them less active, putting them in bed rest, or putting a cast on their leg. So activity is clearly part of this, which sort of cues up the next part of the talk. Some parting words on what protein can do, and you'll forgive me on this for the laundry list. Higher protein is associated, so it's an observational study, with greater lean mass, or greater muscle mass. It's associated with greater hand grip strength, which is a ridiculously good predictor of morbidity and mortality. Higher protein and evenly distributed throughout the day is associated with greater knee extensor, so that's the kicking activity, strength. It's associated with greater gait speed, and probably all of you are familiar with the concept that the slower you get with aging, that's a really big predictor of morbidity and mortality. And higher leucine, at least in one study, is associated with greater lean mass retention over a 5-year span. I'm going to point out one particular study, mainly because I like where it came from. It's recent, and it really highlights something kind of cool. These are the observational studies. These are the associations, and they're all green lights between protein and all of the outcomes. But there's no clinical trials, or very few clinical trials. So if I go for actual evidence, I get 2 out of 8. So experimentally, I can't tell you that one causes the other. More protein causes this. I can just tell you that it's associated. It takes a long time for these effects to be manifest. This study came out in February of 2024. It's from a study cohort that is really controlled by Harvard University, and that's the Nurses' Health study. It's been going for a long time. It's predominantly female because that's the profession. And I'm going to highlight a few things here. First of all, there were 48,762. I know NHS here is different. That's the Nurses' Health study. Okay, participants in 1984. Right? So when it first started, a few people can remember what they were doing in '84, except for you guys who all weren't around, right? No. So it's all good. And then it's all the way to 2014, so 30 years. They looked at healthy aging, which was defined as being free from 11 major chronic diseases, having good mental health, and not having impairments in either cognitive or physical function. What do they mean? These are the 11 chronic diseases. Free from. Free. None of these. So with 30 years. Cancer, type 2 diabetes, myocardial infarction, heart procedure, congestive heart failure, stroke, kidney failure, obstructive pulmonary disease,
Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and ALS. Okay, who'd like to be free of those? Absolutely. Not only that, they looked at subjective memory, they looked at physical function, and they made assessments of mental status. So these people were considered to be pretty healthy agers. Now, I don't want to give you the depressing statistic, which is that the number of people who fell into this category from the original was not many over 30 years. But still, it's a win. The odds ratios, and odds ratios are essentially your chance of having or not having this condition, but in this case, it's having this condition, okay, were 1.05 for every 3% energy increment. Essentially, that means you have a 5% better chance if you consumed more protein in 1984 of being in that group of individuals than you did. 5%, that's not too bad. 7% if you ate more animal protein. 14% if you ate more dairy protein. But 38% if you ate more plant protein. Now immediately this says one thing to you. The protein per se in all of these categories is associated with a beneficial outcome. Plant protein was also associated with higher odds or absence of physical functional limitations and good mental status. So maybe the type of protein, or what is also associated with the plant protein per se, is important for these outcomes. But in no situation, contrary to what you will hear, and I'll kind of wrap up with that, is protein bad for you. The perfect active aging formula. So you can't get a guy from the kinesiology department or sports sciences or human kinetics, call it whatever you want, PE, if you did it about 30 years ago, to come here and talk just about protein, because the far bigger, and in deference to Professor Steve Harridge, who gave this talk last year, Paul told me I couldn't talk about exercise. Sorry, I'm going to talk about exercise. Better thing that you can do is to be physically active. So what if you have treatment that can lower risk for all known chronic diseases? It works regardless of your age, sex, race, ethnicity. Doesn't matter when you started. We already have a large evidence base. You don't need to do any science. The recommendations are solid. It saved the healthcare system billions of dollars, pounds, and cost comparatively little. The side effect, the off-target effects of this include better prognoses for a variety of unrelated ailments, including sleep onset, sleep latency, sleep duration, depression, dementia, suicide incidents, you name it. Okay? Well, we already have it. All right? Don't need to do any science there. The hard part is obviously getting people to do it. Just to, so that we're clear, somebody was saying me, if I had a drug, that was you, Bradley, yeah, so this is Ron Davis, unfortunately not a particularly successful ager, died of prostate cancer, but this is his quote, if we had a pill or surgery, it'd be my most widely prescribed drug in the world. I'm absolutely certain of that. People are trying to capture this, but they'll never capture the whole thing. They capture little bits of it. They call them exercise mimetics. Never going to happen. Physical activity. This is everything. Everything we do. We get up out of bed. We move around. Any activity that results in energy expenditure, that's physical activity. Gardening, going for a walk, you name it. Exercise is planned, structured, repetitive, done with the aim of maintaining or improving physical fitness or strength. And I'll sort of distinguish between the two a little bit as we run through this. You've got the same guidelines, they're the same as ours, it's pretty much the same the world over. 150 minutes a week, 2 days a week of strength training, and minimizing the amount of sedentary time or doing what you folks are doing, sitting around. But that's okay, just for a little bit to this. It's cool. The bad news, I think people tell a big fib when they fill out these surveys because they always want to look better. But I'll say that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 men, and 1 in 4 women, and 1 in 5 men are completely inactive. They do nothing. Only 34% and 24% of males and females engage in strengthening work. And believe me, when you get to probably around your 75th birthday, if you're around for that, there'll be something that you want to do that you're going to find really hard to do. I don't know what it is. It's going to be getting in and getting out of a car, going up and down stairs. It could be, carrying groceries or something like that. And it's not going to be limited by your aerobic fitness, your heart, your lungs. It's going to be limited by your strength and your power. In fact, just about every activity of daily living or instrumental activity of daily living has associated with it an element of strength or power. So what can we expect if we follow the aerobic guidelines? So the 150 minutes a week, what are we going to get? It's phrased in terms of hazard ratio. We'll sort of ignore that for now. But I like this and I use it mainly because it gives you years of life gained, which I think is kind of a win. So imagine tomorrow if the Mail, the Sun, the Mirror, the Telegraph, the Times, if they all reported the same headline, wouldn't that be something, right? There'd be somebody would spin it negatively. This is where the guidelines sit, and I'm like, I've invented a drug that can give you on average just about 3.5 more years of life. Stop the press, right? I'd be team's call from Tahiti right now. Instead of, it's fine to be in Manchester, but if I else, all right, that's not bad. Okay. Oops, sorry. So when we talk about this 150 minutes, and just to compress a lot of years of data, here's what we have evidence-based support for with moderate to vigorous physical activity. So if you follow this, we've got a reduced risk or improving prognosis for heart disease, cancers. 13 of the 26 leading cancers, your risk of getting them is cut if you follow these guidelines. Nothing can do that. There's not even a drug close to doing that. Okay? Type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, and dementia. Remember, no good drugs for treatment of Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. What can we expect if we follow the strengthening activity guidelines? The depressing answer for a person that spends a lot of time talking about people who need to be strong, I can't give you the same graph because we don't have the same abundance of data. But I'll show you what happens when you combine the strengthening and the aerobic. These are hazard ratios. So if doing nothing, you would be at 1. And everything less than 1 means your odds of all-cause mortality in red, if you follow the strengthening guidelines, or you get about a 10% reduction. If you follow the aerobic, you get about a 20% reduction. If you do both, that's the yellow line, you get almost a 40% reduction. So in a given period of time, if we had 1,000 people and we compared them to 1,000 other people, and the 1,000 people did both the strength and the moderate to vigorous physical activity guidelines, you get a 40% survival advantage in those people over the group that sat there and did nothing. The same is true with death from cardiovascular disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, obesity. We can talk about metabolic syndrome and high cholesterol. The effects aren't quite as pronounced there, but not bad, at least from my perspective. We've got evidence-based support if you follow twice a week strengthening for lowering your risk of mortality or improving prognosis from cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis. Contrary to what a lot of OA patients will tell you, whether it's OA of knee, hip, hands, toes, whatever, shoulders. Resistance exercise actually improves symptoms and reduces pain. The hard part with OA sufferers is to actually get them to move in the first place. And it's a really big barrier. Once they start moving and getting stronger, it actually alleviates their symptoms. It doesn't exacerbate them. A lot of walking doesn't help, ironically enough. Oh, falls. I mean, this is where strengthening and when you add balance really is the winner. And if any of you know an older person who has fallen, you'll know that it's a watershed moment for them in terms of their quality of life and in terms of their survival. Protein. Can't talk about protein without talking about the good, which hopefully I've just told you a little bit about, the bad and the ugly. Here's a public service announcement. I had done this for, I've been a McMaster for 28 years, doing research in this area for over 30. And I went on a letter writing campaign when I was young and probably dumb and, to try and convince people to change the narrative in undergraduate textbooks that protein caused kidney failure. And sometimes people throw the liver in there as well. I don't know how the liver got into the mix or whatever, but it's like a brown internal organ. It's way bigger than the kidney, but and somewhere vaguely people remember that it's involved in amino acid metabolism. But there are no data, zero, data linking higher protein diets to the development of renal disease. This is a 60-year-old hypothesis put forward by a guy named Barry Brenner. And I know it's sort of Brandolini's law, right? Brandolini's law has a number of other names, but once an idea or a hypothesis is out there, the amount of work done to refute it and get it out of sort of popular lay, particularly lay, but even medical textbooks and teaching and learning is 10 times more than the work it took to put the idea. So 60 years ago, Brenner comes out with this, mostly rodent data, and trying to remove it or extract it is like, trying to chisel off one of the 10, nephrologist commandments. High protein does not cause kidney failure. Even the FAO, WHO report says this. The Institute of Medicine says this. I'm not going to read you the quotes, but there's no relationship between declines in kidney function with age and protein intake. Is really the takeaway point. So where does this come from? It comes from flawed circular logic. And the circular logic works like this. People with chronic kidney disease, CKD or renal failure, are put on lower protein diets because that reduces the amount of solute that the kidney has to filter. And in doing so, the kidney lasts for longer and the person survives longer. What that does not mean is that protein caused the kidney failure. That's what we call incorrect circular logic. So it's wrong. And 60 years later, we're still looking for data for this one. So it's time to stop saying this. It's time to tell your neighbor, your friend, everybody, even your consultant nephrologist, like it's just not true. There are no data. And I know absence of evidence isn't, but 60 years, man. Are we there yet? 60 years of no data. And there's some rogue nephrologists out there who are saying actually probably not that big a deal. You can enjoy protein because actually one of the things that happens in chronic kidney disease is you lose muscle like crazy. So the first thing you do is you restrict protein. What do you think that does to muscle? You lose more of it. One soapbox. There's some resources. Happy to send you the slides. I won't belabor the point. The other one is the protein makes your bones soft, and somehow you're predisposed because of the acidic environment that protein causes to increase fractures. And actually, the exact opposite is true. There are 3 nutrients which are bone supportive: calcium, vitamin D, and protein. When you dial number 1 and number 2 in, and you get number 3, and you do some physical activity, that's like the triumvirate of nutrients combining with the mechanical effect on bone to support bone health. No adverse effects. Longevity. Now, this is one that's sort of more recent, and I think a lot of it has come out of looking at animal models, and that if you restrict protein in animal models, you get an extension of lifespan. There's another model that is restricting energy in animals, and that also extends lifespan. The protein restriction effect is much more modest than the caloric restriction effect, but it's a way of essentially testing in a hermetically sealed environment with a short-lived, small, inbred animal model the effect of depriving certain nutrients on its lifespan. These are reviews of human data. One shows a positive, in other words, a flip, and it's the study that I showed you from Harvard, that protein is actually associated with a reduced disease burden. And the other ones are essentially neutral. There's no net negative effect. So I don't mean to diminish the cellular or animal-based data that's out there that a lot of people lean heavily on when they're talking about protein and longevity. But the simple answer is when you look at human data, at least observational data, because we haven't got a lifelong clinical trial yet. Sorry, that was a science joke, but there's no way somebody's going to fund a lifelong feeding trial in humans. Anybody wants to volunteer. So we have to rely on this type of data. I'm looking for the smoking gun, and I don't see it. So I'm not sure that I'd put too much faith in the longevity. Putting it all together. So it would be somewhat perverse of me to come here and to suggest to you that the key to aging well is eating a little bit more protein, although I think that's a good step, or that it's physical activity, because there's a lot more to aging well. When you look at super agers, people who live disease-free for a very long period of their life, people who regularly live to be centenarians, they're dotted all over the world. The whole myth that they exist in blue zones is exactly that. It's a myth. They're everywhere. They're the country with the highest number of centenarians in the EU is what? Germany. You got to put a lot of things together. And it's not just physical activity or eating or moving or eating, although these are all good. You've got to sleep well. I'm currently working on this one. And definitely recovery. I don't recommend overnight flights with Air Canada as a starter. But you've got to maintain connection, mental engagement, relationships, a sense of purpose. For those of you who know Barbara Freed, who lends her name to probably the most used frailty index, a big project that she undertook in the Washington, D.C. area that had an enormously positive effect on older people's lives was to have them interact with younger people and to engage them in volunteer experiences. So there was an intergenerational mojo, voodoo, you don't know what it is, life energy that flowed from the young people to the old people. A sense of purpose, a sense of community, a sense of belonging is probably underrated in terms of where it fits into this lexicon. So while movement and physical activity and mobility are great. More protein and all of the other things are great. Sleeping is a big deal. Still working on that one. But having a good circle of friends, good social circle, social in the sense of like real friends, not this online social media, because I don't think that's really the same type of connection. These are the things that superagers have in common when you look at it. Whoops. Thank you very much.